But thank you for being on this panel. The panel is a close one to my heart, and I think the genesis of the panel, at least in its seed idea, is the result of having to listen to years of Ignite talks at the International Crisis Mappers conferences that have been held across the world over the past couple of years. Much like the Ignite talks, or what do they call them? Flash talks. Yeah. What do you call it? Short talks. Short talks at Build Peace. The format is a very interesting one, and it really kindles the interest in what is being presented by many people who come and talk about their projects, programs, and initiatives. What frustrated me as a Sri Lankan who has lived most of his life in war till 2009, when my country came out of war, but it's still suffering from systemic violence, is that there was little to no reflection about why you succeeded, and almost an absolute silence around failure. So sometimes what was projected and promoted as something that really did work, there was really little to no contextualization around why it did what it did. And this was frustrating because sometimes it was genuinely exceptional, and it wasn't really applicable in any other context, time, place, or process other than that which it was being presented as. And reciprocally, people were really very scared to talk about failure. We all talk about failing forward and failing fast and failing fully and the whole thing, but we don't really talk about failure. This is resistance to kind of explore why we went wrong. Possibly because we think we're judged. When there are donors in the room, obviously there's resistance to talking about a project that they might have funded that they might not know why it failed at all. So there were frustrations. So when I was thinking about the panel, I was thinking about this assumption that what we are talking about in terms of technology, whatever that tech may be, it might be a facsimile, it might be virtual reality, that its mere introduction is a guarantee of a successful peace-building process or initiative. And Helen and I have recently co-authored a paper, and she used a really interesting term in that paper, where she critiqued this notion of the mere introduction of tech to be a guarantor of success as post-political. I think that merits some attention, and that's what the panelists will, I think, also do in 3 different ways. I very strongly feel that technology needs to be, as is in the description in the books in front of you, plus up also on the web, the introduction of tech needs to be framed within the cultural, power, gender, contextual, temporal, geopolitical, geospatial dynamics of the place in which it is introduced into, and it is used by. And it is only after a fuller exploration of that can we understand how we can probably use tech for peace building in a manner that does no harm and is more sustainable. What has been particularly fulfilling in leading up to the panel has been a fairly long, possibly at least for the panelists, frustrating experience with interacting with me on a Google Doc. The experience has been very enriching and fulfilling, and I think it will reflect in the comments that they make. They come from 3 very different perspectives, but I think there's great complementarity. The presentations will be short. They'll be 10 minutes. The idea was that we have more time for Q&A. They will be deliberately provocative. We will not endeavor to present solutions. We certainly will not endeavor to crow about successes. We will come to you, I hope, with challenges, and that will lead to a greater discussion, because that really is what I wanted and what I think the organizers also wanted. I will not do the usual and read out what is in the book. I mean, you know what the panel is about. You also know the panelists. I have a slightly fuller description, which I will also not say in full to embarrass them even more. But just to give you an idea, Philip, in addition to actually what is in the booklet, He is also a co-author of something very important sounding, Democratic Dialogue, a Handbook for Practitioners. I just love those semicolon in these titles because it makes it sound bloody nice actually. So I'm sure that, that's a fantastic book, but I think Philip, brings to this, this session work across a number of continents over a couple of decades. And I think what he will be talking about is going to kind of kindle some really interesting questions. Sabrine, we were talking just before the plenary, is actually in Beirut, and we were talking about how, in a sense, I recognize this because and I suppose many of you who've lived for a long time in conflict, when you live for a long time in conflict, the normalization of that violence is something that you're not always aware of. So your threshold for violence actually increases. So it's interesting always for me to have a discussion around tech and peace building with people who live within cycles of violence, because it's a fundamentally different perspective that people then take. And Sabrine, I think, will bring that plus a more gendered conversation. And Oren is part of the USAID OTI, the Office of Transition Initiatives, which actually was rather strong in Sri Lanka back in the day. But before that was also with interviews, so there's a nice media perspective that it brings. We will proceed in the order that they are seated in, so Philip, Sabrine, and Oren. As I said, we'll keep the submissions short, around 10 minutes, and then we'll go for a Q&A. So Philip.
He says keep them short. You should have seen the questions he was asking us to address. First of all, Patrick, what a fantastic presentation. I'm just still awed by what he was presenting and realize I'm in the wrong sandbox. I'd rather play with you and the work you're doing. I do want to start, when they asked if I would do a panel, I said, but I'm not a technology guy, I don't do technology. And they said, that's okay, at least you do peace building. So I just want to acknowledge with full transparency, I'm not the geek up here. However, I would never fall asleep reading a novel, but I could stay up all night reading a book like Patrick's. I love computer manuals, so I guess I'm an amateur geek. For the past 30 years, I've been doing peace building work involved in most of the Latin American countries and the peace processes there, and then more recently in Afghanistan and in Somalia. And I guess a couple of reflections I'll share are just what are some of the problems where I think technology would be really interesting to explore. From the sidelines, what little I do know, where do I think technology could add value? I can't really speak to many experiences that have failed or succeeded, except the opportunities that I see. And peace building is a really big and fuzzy field. And there's at least two primary roles. The first 10 years of my life was more in activism and human rights work. And the last 20 years or so has been more in dialogue. Advocacy is an important and continues to be an important role, particularly under the topic of inclusion. How do we make sure that the voices that are traditionally marginalized somehow are amplified and heard in order to reform processes? I think that's incredibly valid, and I switched roles about 20 years ago when I realized that on just about any issue in the context where I was working, at that time, Latin America, there was plenty of people on just about any side of the issue that was advocating, and there was fewer people who were really working at how do you hold a space when you have to bring people together in a reconstruction and peace-building context to rebuild society. That means bring people from very different perspectives, bring the perps, bring the victims, bring the government, bring the ex-insurgents. How do you create the space for them to come together? You know, I think you all know the experiences of the Zapatistas. We know some of the experiences in the Arab world where technology has been very useful at mobilizing, very useful at organizing, very useful at doing advocacy work. Where I would like to see technology become more influential is how do you build a platform that really allows people to then make sense across perspectives. I was listening to Patrick and just dreaming about what would an aerial view look like that would offer me a 3D perspective of some of the deep political divides that aren't physical, that would allow people to go to the balcony and really take perspective. How would I get a drone to fly over Somalia and get people to somehow, just for a moment, take a view that's a time span of 20 years and not just a time span of tomorrow, to see the deeply embedded patterns that are continuing to ensure that some of the same old conflicts and the realities are living are sustained and recreated. So I celebrate the the use of social media. I lament the fact that oftentimes it seems like it's becoming an echo chamber of the like-minded. On the dialogue side, on the one side of Peacebuilding, I'm longing for seeing platforms and technologies that really help people cross over perspectives, which made me really celebrate what Ronnie was talking about today with FriendMe and seeing the connections being made. Most of the processes, formal processes that I've been part of at political negotiations at the highest level, tend to, and about 15 years ago I wrote a paper asking where are all the publics in these democracies, tend to be very elite and leader-driven. And I think it's probably true in most of the contexts I've worked where you can almost anticipate who's going to be at the table to negotiate X, Y, or Z issue. And usually the common citizen isn't there. So I'm intrigued in wondering what would it look like to have technology that would really mobilize and empower the voice of citizens. And a couple examples that strike me as fascinating. There have been some good experiences in my country, in the United States. And I think there's room to start trying this in other places. One is the American Speaks model, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. But in a context like Somalia, where bringing masses of people together, because some of the insecure zones, it's not easy to get everyone together. What would it look like to have the technology to do what we did in California, for instance, when we had a Connected Cities dialogue in healthcare, where at the same time, same day, thousands of people were meeting in 5 different venues, and they were deliberating on the same issue. And it was simulcast, so I could see on the screen what was going on in a city different from mine, and I could feel like I was part of something bigger. I was connected. And hearing the voice and having the ability and the technology to offer, to do polling, for me to throw out a question like was done earlier in the panel, say, what do you think on X, Y, or Z issue, and carefully frame it so that I could get immediately projected on the screen the response to a poll taken of 2,000 people. The power that has of minimizing the role of the formal leaders and the formal representatives that say they represent a certain perspective, when you know that if you ask the people out in the streets, you're going to get a much more nuanced perspective. How do we use those technologies in the room? I've done this in large groups, and groups are just fascinated to hear a question and see the poll responses immediately projected saying, I would have never thought this group would come out on that way on that issue. And it's a way, again, of really deepening the thinking and deepening the shared understanding across perspectives rather than simply having technology that allows each voice to simply download the cassette that they bring into the room. In dialogue, I've often, and I haven't tried this in any of the formal political dialogue process I've been part of, but I do think it has been tried in other contexts. The research done on computer-mediated communication is really fascinating in terms of empowering. 7 years ago, I read a study where they were doing research of what happens in conversations that take place asynchronously across time between groups that are polarized. And the interesting results was that, for instance, in a graduate setting, undergraduate students were 5 times more likely to participate actively in that dialogue than they would be in a face-to-face meeting. Women were 5 times more likely to participate than they would be in a face-to-face meeting. Again, the elimination of the nonverbals and the identity in the class that shows up in rooms shows that, not that it can substitute face-to-face, but what would blended processes of dialogue look like using technology? What's fascinating, at least in the way we do dialogue when we bring people together, we do verbatim minutes. And when you can trace back over 3 meetings ago and see what was said, and then see what party A is responding to, and then see how they were responded to, you have a written record of how did we get where we're at today? How are we making sense? One person thought they said one thing, but it was understood in a different way. We now have the technology, I think, through some of the models of computer-mediated communication, to add value to how we talk together. Because my theory of change is if we can shift the way we talk about things, then much of our realities will change substantively. I'll close on just 2 last points. There was a really interesting process, a national dialogue called Text, Talk, Act, that was organized around mental health in my country. And I think it's fascinating to try in many of the other countries where I work in. Well orchestrated, it embodies using SMS, where there was a strong PR campaign nationwide, groups were organized, and it consisted of inviting people to get groups of 3, 4, or 5 people in a cafe, in a home, and wherever, and at a certain time during a 24-hour period, they could text to a certain number, start. As soon as they did that, that group would receive some questions, they would receive a poll, they'd be given time to talk to themselves, and they could upload and text their responses, all of which are being harvested into one main area. I think over 40,000 people participated in that. The outcomes are posted on the website, and it seems to me a wonderfully active and creative way of mobilizing truly nationwide conversations around things that matter. My final comment is technology, we already said, good or bad, it really depends on use. So I like the phrase technology in use. I've seen a lot, I love the games, a lot of the technologies that are working at doing culture change, working with children, other technologies that are meant to include voices, to facilitate dialogue. I think those are powerful in polarized contexts to the extent that they are situated into a much broader and more coherent theory of change. It's not the technology alone that's going to bring the change. In many of the contexts where I've been, what that might mean in a deeply divided society is putting together what we would call a group of champions. These are outstanding people that are not impartial. It's actually, we call it the insider partial model. But you put a group of people together who are well known in society for either being the good people or the bad people, but collectively, they understand the technology, the change effort that's underway, and if they endorse it, if they back it, if they comment on it and participate in it, it's one way of bringing legitimacy to something that would otherwise could appear as, well, that's just another gimmick from his side or her side. So again, I love technology. I love this conference. I think it's a wonderful sandbox for us to do incredibly innovative things in the world of peace building, and thank you.
So, hello everyone. I'm working on information warfare in the Middle East. So I choose to give you like 3 examples. So how they're using the web in the Middle East. My first example is about Syria, the Syrian context, because when we started the Arab Spring with Tunisia and Egypt, the use of the web was using for revolts and everything. But in Syria, the context is very different because the regime used the web as a tool of repression. So it's very different in Syria. So in Syria, cyber dissidents fought the regime with Facebook and Twitter and encouraged all the manifestations. But the problem is that when the regime created fake accounts on Twitter and Facebook, they catch the bloggers and the cyber activists from the frontiers or from the house. So they have to flee out of the country. So they started to work outside the country. So the good thing that they did is that they give information to the outside world, and they share the technology to uphold the protest. But the problem is the regime created the Syrian Electronic Army. They started cyber attacks. They started to get information from the people. And I will give you an example. When the war started in Syria, bloggers came in Lebanon. I met some of them. Some of them became my friends, and those activists were very happy about all the revolution. When people are coming from Europe to go to Iraq and Syria, and I'm talking about this example of a young girl, she was 15, and she left Europe to go to ISIS. We need to ask this question: what is the message that ISIS gives to these people, to the young people? So another example is the movie. I don't know if you know about it. The name of the movie is Flame of War. It's a documentary made by ISIS, like a Hollywood trailer. And this movie was uploaded on Twitter. And so with this movie, we can see that ISIS are they are using social media not just for propaganda, but they want to send a message to people, and I think that they want to legitimate something that is going on the field. My last example, it's an example from Lebanon. It's a non-governmental organization named CAFA. In English, CAFA means enough. So this organization, they are working on, they encourage social mobilization. They wanted to create a law against women and children abuse in Lebanon. So they started a social media campaign on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. When they started this campaign, they continued the campaign with television, radio, and we started to manifest on the street. And after many years of campaign, in 2014, Lebanon's parliament passed the law making domestic violence a criminal offense. So it was a very good experience in Lebanon because it was the first time that with social media, we use social media to pass a law. We still have problems with this law, but I think we need to start somewhere. So I'm working on 3 questions. The first is I'm working on this question. Is the first like how to use the web, and because of the case of Syria and ISIS, we see that we have the problem of violence on the web. How to educate children in the Middle East. So we need a web education. So how to do it? Because we need the web we need to educate our children so that they can use the web without like saying all these messages and things like the bad things on the web. And my last question is protecting the web. Protecting the children from the cyber dangers against it. Thank you.
So I come at this a little bit from a practitioner's perspective, having done development for a while, and particularly focusing on traditional media and ICT. One thing I will say that's interesting today, I've been to a few conferences over the years, and I think in the early days when they started having technology conferences, and the question was raised, is technology the answer? I was like, yes, it is the answer. And now people are, it's partially the answer. And I actually think that's good because it reflects kind of a maturity in the sector where people are beginning to realize that technology is a tool, but it's a tool that can help, but it's not a guarantee of success. And particularly for something like peacebuilding, which is a long, hard slog, it takes a lot of work. Technology can help quite a bit, but it definitely is not the answer to all of our challenges in doing that. So I guess I'm gonna, I have an easier time pointing out failures than successes from my own experience. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about some of the challenges that I found over the years in doing some of this type of work. I think in the early days, everyone was rightly excited about the decentralizing effect of ICT, that it decentralizes power and information flows so that anyone can contribute into dialogues in ways that they couldn't under the traditional media where you had broadcast media pumping information out, but there wasn't a lot of interactivity. And social media has opened up the possibility of interactivity in a way that was not possible a couple of decades ago. And I think the thought is since everyone could participate, that they would participate. And I think the reality is we now know is that just because you create a platform for participation does not mean people will participate. And I think one of the big challenges that we're now facing is how do we incentivize people to participate, and even in something that would seemingly be something they're very interested in, like a peace process. Just because you can contribute to a platform doesn't mean you will, and there's all kinds of disincentives to doing so. So I think understanding the motivations and the incentives for participation.
Who's got a loud voice than me? Yeah. Apparently we're having an electricity problem, but it's going to come back in a second.
So we're having an electricity problem. It's going to come back in just a second. So if everyone could just be patient with us for a minute or two, hopefully we'll have everything back up. You probably also noticed first that the wireless... Yeah.
Oh, there we go. Nice.
Yes, so I think basically, like our big challenge now is understanding motivations and incentives for participating in these peace processes. And while technology enables a much greater sense of participation, it doesn't mean that people will. And so I think the big push, at least I find personally, is how do you create, how do you use technology and how do you create structures that enable participation? And then the hard bit is then how do you make sure that people actually use those? Another thing I've noticed is that when people are using ICT and peacebuilding and a lot of other social mobilizations, there's often a question of, particularly on Facebook, where the currency is likes, and having been both on a practitioner side or working for an NGO and now working for the donor side, you sort of translate. You look for easy metrics like, oh, so many people looked at our page, or so many people liked our page, therefore we were successful. And I'm not sure that that actually is true. And just because someone looks at something or someone likes something does not necessarily mean they've changed any behaviors or have changed their opinions about anything. And while there is this assumption that getting mass reach matters, I would kind of question that. All we have to think about is the Coney 2012. Anyone remember that? Where like everyone is involved in this, and the most viral campaign ever, which is all very impressive, but that was a flash in the pan. Coney's still out there as far as we know, and it's completely fallen off the agenda. So sometimes like having mass interest, it's hard to sustain it, and if something doesn't change very quickly, then it just drops off, and at the end you're sort of scratching your head like, and what was the point of that whole exercise, and does Justin Bieber still care about catching Joseph Kony? I'm not sure. So I would just say that I think that while reaching a mass audience can be good, as practitioners we really need to think very specifically about who is our audience and why do we want them to care about whatever we're focused on. And we need to do more of that, and I'm using the royal we, but I also am speaking about me personally. Like in our work, we need to do that more. Recently, since I moved to Ukraine in October, I've also faced kind of a new challenge, which is how does having a very, very determined state spoiler who is using technology and information as a weapon affect the dynamics? So while we are, I would say, doing small initiatives on media, when you have a large and extremely well-financed quasi-military operation run by a state actor, what role can civil society and non-state actors realistically play in facing that kind of information? And I think a lot of people have been caught flat-footed by that. And it's much discussed in the media now about how the Russians are fielding a kind of a troll army, and there's been a lot of reporting on that. I think, frankly, a lot of us don't have answers to that yet. It's very hard to counteract a very, very large amount of people aggressively putting out a certain message. Or even if they're not putting out a certain message, which is easy to trace, just trying to make things uncertain, injecting huge levels of uncertainty into what is otherwise a very, very certain situation. And I think that, again, I hate to say it, but I think that will probably be an increasing trend as states are finally catching up to the fact that the internet is not like something for a small elite, but is actually becoming much, much more mainstreamed, where you have a determined state actor that's trying to control flows of information. This is something that we're going to be faced with a lot more. And then finally, Sanjana did ask us to have kind of a gendered critique. I'm not a gender expert, so I'm a little bit out of my depth. But I will say that I think that technology tends to reflect the biases of the culture that it's in. So I've seen places where technology is kind of, women are either blocked from access to technology. I've seen this in Pakistan, where parents won't let their daughters use mobile phones specifically because they don't want them to have access to alternative views to where they are. But I think that's not a reflection of technology so much as a reflection of the culture in which people are operating. So I think gender kind of fits into this thing. Well, it does matter, but it's usually a reflection of the society that's in. And those are my comments.
I think the panel broke new ground on two areas. One is the lack of use of PowerPoint, which is, I think, quite phenomenal. The other is that all three of the panelists were under time, which is just incredible. Stunning stuff, actually. I feel I need a drink. Seriously. If you had seen the discussions on the Google Doc, I wasn't confident of this. I think that, as I said, the panelists did raise some really interesting questions. I will not endeavor to synthesize all of that. As I said, as much time that we have is for discussion. I think that what resonated with me was this leitmotif of unintended consequences, that for the best of intentions, we might end up with the worst of outcomes. That's not something we deal with very well. We tend to have the ostrich approach, which is to bury our heads in the sand and think it never happened, or that it happened because we didn't have anything to do with it and it's really not our problem. But the introduction, the use, the maturity of technology in peace-building processes suggests that we don't always have a handle on what it ends up being. And even though we might like to be the architects of change, there are also competing architectures of violence that contest and contrast with our worldview. And it's interesting to see how we deal as a community with those unintended consequences as a consequence of the introduction of tech. I think Sabrine raised in large part what Patrick is also dealing with and hinted at, which is the dual use of technology. I mean, in Patrick's world, it could be that just as much as you have all of what he's showed us, you also have the predator, and just as much as you have the predator, you also have what he showed. So, you know, how do you deal with the family of drones and UAS or UAV in light of the fact that there is always going to be, and probably the primary driver of innovation is going to be the military industry in that particular domain? How do we wrest control away of that technology to suit our ends and our purposes, including the definition and the appropriation of that technology and term? I think you raised a very fundamental point, which is often overseen. You call it a different thing. I think, Oren, I mean, you would be familiar with this. It's media literacy. It's how to deal with the kind of content that is now being produced as a consequence of the democratization of technology. And one of this, we haven't talked about it on this panel, but we did talk about it at the first Build piece, and it's certainly part of the crisis mapping community, is the world of big data. You know, how do you deal with the volume veracity questions around the generation of ever-increasing content that you can't really ascertain the authorial nature of. Oren, I think, again, I mean, it was familiar to me because we discussed it in our Google Doc, but I think it might be also familiar to many in the audience. For me, it's really interesting to see what the metrics of participation and success are. When we say that a process is participatory, when we say that something is successful, what on earth do we really mean? Do metrics and definitions translate across geographies and communities and languages and genders? I don't know. And continents. Perhaps they do, perhaps they don't. What is interesting for me, Oren, from what you spoke about, is that ironically, technology can also create even greater resistance to peace building. One of the challenges, for example, I'm dealing with as an activist back home in Sri Lanka is that we had a horrible 10 years under an autocratic president. There's a new president as of the 8th of January this year. And contributing to the new president's election was an incredibly animated younger demographic who use social media to promote political change and create political dialogue. Now, the problem is not so much the new president, but a completely and utterly mismatched expectation around what the new president can and will deliver in a short space of time. Now, the problem is that with increasing disillusionment and disenchantment with what the president can deliver, after all, you're talking about an architecture that still means that he cannot deliver what you would like him to deliver on. That the next time around, that same demographic might take to the same technologies to express their disillusionment. Not hope, not imagination, not new architectures of conflict transformation, but architectures of disillusionment and, in effect, violence, apathy, disengagement. So in a sense, it's interesting for me also to explore, if we can and have the time, how technology can actually be inimical to a just peace and process of peace building. Those are just some of the things that animated me. They might not be the same things that animated you, but the floor is open for questions.
Or it could be the shortest session of the day.
It could be the shortest session of the day. People want. There is a question up front. We have 2 mics. And if the other mic could be given to the gentleman in the white shirt so that you can follow up quickly.
So this is actually to answer Philip's question about technologies being used in a participatory process. And I have a great peace building exercise, which I'm trying to find the online tools to make it happen online. So maybe this is a good group effort. So I do conflict mapping. I do it both for peace journalism training and just general peace building training, where we map actors. So identify actors, identify their needs, interests, and then do an empathy exercise to identify the basic needs that come under it. And it's very interesting when you do it across lines, across groups, and across geographies. And so if there's anyone here who can help us turn it into an online exercise, because sometimes it's hard to get people in the same room, this could be a tool that you could use, and I'm sure many other peace builders could use too. So.
Gentlemen, the...
Okay. Well, thanks very much. It's really exciting to listen to you. I think my question goes to how do you deal with the, in every context you go, there are already kind of power dynamics installed, and these are for or against any kind of peace construction. How do you see this kind of technology that you're taking with you being challenged by the existing kind of structures and kind of social structures that are there?
Well, I mean, I guess this thinking from some of the other countries that I've worked in and around. I mean, I think often in the early days of the internet, a lot of, again, because countries were not necessarily so concerned on the use of technology initially. I mean, I think a lot of countries, particularly on information, started very comfortable with the monopoly on broadcasting, newspapers. They had the tools there, and they were slow to realize that internet could have a disruptive effect on information flows and reach far more people than were actually on the internet based on people sharing things via SMS or something else. What I did notice is that a lot of countries have started to, I mean, there's direct censorship where they are blocking websites, blocking narratives that they don't like. That's kind of the bluntest instrument that they have. And then in a lot of countries, they've started putting in legislation which makes you liable, sometimes criminally liable, for information if it's retweeted. Like in China, they put up a thing that on Weibo, if you have more than 500 reposts of your content, you become criminally liable under Chinese law for whatever you posted. So, and I don't know that anyone has actually yet been taken to court over a post that they put up, but it's enough to put a chilling effect. And so I think a lot of countries, without wanting to seem like they're actively blocking content, they're also putting in legislation which just creates just enough of a disincentive to freely express your opinion, and you sort of know what they don't want you to talk about, and so people tend not to. So I've seen that, I mean, a lot of power structures tend to think, they've also, a lot of governments have become smarter about how they do this, because they know if they do active blocking of content, sometimes that provokes a reaction, and they're frowned upon by the international community. So you can put in slightly more insidious legislation that maybe you don't notice immediately, but has the same impact of blocking people's perspective, which you don't want to have out there.
Yeah. My quick answer, I don't know what the technological response to that is, but power asymmetry isn't new into any context. So this is where, depending on the situation, I put on my hat as activist, and I think, if I understand power is, I love this formula, PAB equals DBA. Power of A over B is equal to the dependency of B has on A. So I wonder, I mean, if it's a communication or technology is just a tool, that you're blocking my use of a hammer, how can you use other tools to do that? So I think it would be a different conversation. I know it's outside of the scope of this, but the political tools we have that aren't necessarily technological to kind of leverage the influence and create openings to use our technology.
There were two other, sorry ma'am, there were two other questions, yes, in front here and one at the back. Could the second mic come up here to this? You go ahead with your question. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Anamika. I'm from UNESCO Mahatma Gandhi Institute in India. I don't know if I can phrase it as a question, but I'm very glad that you raised the point that technology cannot be a panacea to all the problems. And over here, I would like to raise the question of ownership of technology like Facebook and social media, and I'm really encouraged to see the kind of positive engagement that it has generated, but at the same time, who is owning it? And finally, the owners are also hands in glove with the government. So I would be a little careful about my over-reliance on these technologies. And also, I don't know how possible it is to generate technology which is completely owned by people and how effective that would be. For example, recent cases come to my mind based in India and Bangladesh, for example, the hacking of the bloggers in Bangladesh who were actively using social media to reach their point across, or how the government is using technology to really privatize the public data. So in different countries the dynamics are very different, but how do you see that rolling out in the future? Do you see in the future technology being completely owned by the people so that it can be used for the purpose of the people?
Go ahead.
It's actually a follow-up on what she's saying. I'm not sure if it's a reflection or a question, but it's interesting what Sabrine said about criminals and mafia like ISIS and Bashar al-Assad using technology to terrorize people. And the picture becomes like a war online. So every part is building their arms and making it more sophisticated possible. We're trying to use it for peace, and they're trying to use it to terror people. And this war seems to be a long run it's going on. So also just asking you, like, how do you see what do you see the future, and how do you see how you can deal with it in the future, especially that the criminal part is using it more effectively as far as we can see it now.
I don't want to be negative, but I think it's going to be worse. Because they have money, they have technology, they study. Some of ISIS militants are like, they went to university and they learn how to use the web. They're good in cyber attacks. And I will give you the example. You say that, sorry, your name? From India? Yeah, Anamika, she gave me this point, the idea, is that, for example, the regime opened social media to start the repression. So for many years, the Syrian regime blocked social media. So when they saw the opportunity to use it against the people, they opened the social media. So dissidents saw this opportunity for freedom of speech. This is real. This is an opportunity for us. But in the same time, when you know how to use the web and the dark part of the web, you can use it against the people. So I think it's going to be worse in the Middle East, because this is why I said that we need web education, because we need to educate young people and to if you want to educate them in the positive way. So the web is not just not like putting pictures on Facebook or posting things on Twitter. No, it's they're using the social media to pass a message. So.
Oren, do you want to answer Anamika's question?
Ownership,
I think that's a very important one.
Yeah, no, ownership, I mean, it is important because obviously, who owns the data in the end? I mean, especially with something like Facebook. I mean, I guess if you buy shares, you can be a partial owner of your own data. But seriously, I think it's a concern, but I think in general, it's particularly a concern for people who do not have a high sense of, people start getting on social media at a very young age when you're not necessarily thinking about your long-term, it's often framed in terms of, what you put on the web when you're young might come back and bite you in the butt later on in life when you have photos of yourself drunk and passed out in the bushes somewhere. But I think above and beyond that, you're not even, people are getting smarter on that, but young people are not necessarily thinking in the long term about who actually owns that data. And then even if they can go and erase things from their social media accounts, still, who has ultimate ownership over that data? And as we have digital lives, who has ownership over that data? I think it's something that, a lot of us haven't thought, I'm sure in this room many people have thought about it, but I think in general, the general public, people have not thought a lot about it, and it's a big concern. And I don't think, to be totally honest, I don't think that people are going to change patterns of behavior much in the near term. I think it'll take some kind of catastrophic loss of data or release of data in a way that was not intended by a major social media platform before it really forces a conversation about ultimately who owns that information.
Two questions at the back, right at the back. And there was another one in the last row, I think. Yeah? Could we get a mic across? Thanks. Okay, good.
Hi, thank you very much for your opinions on the panel. I think it's a brilliant discussion. Just on the topic of sending a message through technology and how it can be used to send the wrong message or whatever, I think, I know it's not in the context of the conference, but I think those of us here that developed a critical thinking aspect that allows you to say, this is a message that I don't want to subdue to or take into consideration, we developed that critical thinking offline. So I know the discussion is about peace through technology, but I'm just wondering whether perhaps to counteract those messages which are coming through technology which are not positive, whether a good approach would be to go back to offline methods and develop critical thinking offline. Thanks. And your opinions, of course. I'd welcome those.
We'll take the other question as well, yeah? And then we'll answer that.
Hi everyone, Monica from UNICEF in Uganda. Something I haven't heard over the course of the day is the idea of conflict sensitivity and to what extent the way that we deploy this technology is conflict sensitive, even before we get to the point of building peace through it. Just to give you an example, but my colleague Drew will be in the panel next, and we'll be talking a little bit more about how UNICEF is using platforms and technology to build peace through education and so on. But I don't know how many of you, I'm going to do a show of hands, sorry. How many of you have heard of your report? Some of you have, right. Something that we're very proud of, something that started out with a genuine desire to give voice to the voiceless, to promote youth participation, and it's doing that. But it's also been an interesting journey for us, and I'll get to the question in a minute. The idea that that technology can be a little bit blind, and through that blindness, it can reinforce inequity, it can reinforce exclusion, and we need to be very, very watchful about this. We have over 300,000, almost 300,000 people recruited to Europort. That's almost 300,000 people whose voices we can muster, we can mobilize, we can actually, harvest, bring to the table. And then when we've investigated a little bit more about who are these people, we find that there are some constituencies that we're still not reaching, and in fact that the profile of your reporters can be, is perhaps not the constituency that we were hoping to bring to the table. So questions about conflict sensitivity, questions about inequity and exclusion being reinforced through technology. I would like just to, hear your thoughts about how we can not forget the old school, the solid programmatic context, the solid sort of premises of do no harm and conflict sensitivity, the equity agenda, how we can remain anchored, in those principles and those values and pursue this really exciting journey, which is, running with technology. It's running very fast. I just don't want to leave all these kind of old school values and principles behind. So a little bit of a reflection, but also a question of how do we do this? You know, this technology is being driven by new actors, private sector.
Can I ask you to phrase your question?
My question is, how do we do both? How do we pursue the technology, run with it, let it flourish, run, thrive, but at the same time continue to engage these values and these principles? I mean, it's a bit of a rhetorical question, but I hope.
Oh, it's rhetorical, then we don't have to.
Try.
I think you answered it in part. I mean, gets to what I said, that there's technology, then there's technology in use. For me, I'm a peace builder. I work for social change, so my eye isn't on the technology. That's just a tool I'm going to draw on because I understand very clearly in this context it serves this purpose, and this is what I'm going to look forward to. This is what I'm going to pay attention to see if it's either working or not. And hopefully we have good M&E systems that allow us to abort if we begin to see unexpected results we don't anticipate. I would be much more concerned if I was simply a technology developer that's rolling out this thing saying, run with it, folks. This is going to bring peace. So my frame, not as a developer of any specific technology, my frame is as a change agent who's responsible for designing with others change processes, of which technology is only one piece. So I hear exactly what you're saying. I see a greater risk if someone rolls out a new technology they've developed and wants to kind of promote it on its own. It's hard for me to imagine any technology in highly polarized context on its own standing and not raising the kind of concerns that you flag. So I appreciate your call to concept. On taking dialogue offline or hate speech or destructive, I mean, I think what's going to appear online is going to reflect the polarization of the society. So I'm less concerned about necessarily the bad stuff that comes online. I want to use that. I mean, again, I think blended models of closed group dialogues, if we're working on a very specific political change in a given context, where we've mapped out who are the actors that need to be participating, and how do we link those actors, because I'm not referring just to the elite or the political, how do we link those actors with the broader basic constituents they allegedly represent? Technology can help enormously in that, so that our conversations move beyond the elite. I think we've learned a lot about how to do dialogue successfully inside a group. We've learned much less about how to translate any change experience within a group out more into the macro change in society.
Yes.
It's interesting because we just had the award ceremony for Peace Apps and Jordy's here from the Alliance of Civilizations. I wonder whether the challenge is for us in this room, too much as it might sound distasteful, to learn from ISIS and Daesh. Why are they so bloody successful at doing what they do? Surely it can't be a secret. And I think 2 months ago, and some of you in the audience may know this, Facebook for Burma has incorporated emoticons based on the Panzaga movement that in Burma now you can download onto Facebook Messenger and use. So there is Facebook as a company incorporating nonviolent communication in the discussions, or rather the emoticons that are available for Burmese to use in their discussion. So there's interesting ways in which companies also kind of embrace some of these movements. But then Anamika's point is that what do we do then with the Facebook that is the other side of Facebook, which is a company which doesn't always give us control, which never really gives us control of the data that we put onto it. It's an open question. I mean, what do we do with this? I mean, I think Facebook has 1.4 billion monthly active users. The statistics came out about 2 days ago. In the history of mankind, leave aside computing, you've never had this kind of online global community. And I think it raises fundamental questions about how we can both leverage it for the purpose that we are talking about, but also to explore the power dynamics that reside within that network as well, in its use. Questions? We have time. One up front. I don't know who has the mic. Anybody else has a question? You can raise your hands because there's another mic. So there's actually 2 up front here. So Jordy, you go second here. So.
Yeah, so my name is Frauke, I'm working with Peace Nexus Foundation. I have a question, is this thing of dialogue and more at a macro level, at national level. So platforms are dialogue that are perhaps more institutional, permanent in nature, and that can perhaps play a role in perhaps mapping the different perspectives that exist out there, but also then undergoing a process in which a new vision can be built, or at least there will be more understanding about the different visions for the future that exist in the country. Also, perhaps taking that into policy priorities and helping shape the agenda at a macro level. So I think that's been mentioned before, and I think Oren also said that a lot of these dialogue platforms are not necessarily effective because you can create it, but it doesn't mean it gets used. So my question is, have we seen any really good examples of this working? And then what would be some of the critical success factors for that?
We'll take all three questions, yeah, so go ahead with them. And please make them questions.
Yes, my name is Muhammad. From Somalia, Mogadishu. In beginning 2014, Al-Shabaab militant of linked Al-Qaeda, they are forbidding using internet phone. So today, part of Somalia, it is difficult to get internet phone. So they use using the smartphone is today it is reducing paying the smartphones. So if we are society leaders, it is difficult to us when we are sending messages as Facebook and Twitter, because a lot of youth they doesn't get internet available somehow. So as your experience, how can we solve and how can we get the easiest solution we can send in messages the technology? That's my question.
Jordan.
Well, thank you. Well, more than a question, was a little bit kind of a comment on I think, Sabrina, you have mentioned education and the need of education. And, you know, at the Alliance of Civilizations, I work on media education and media literacy. Peace App is just part of media education in our understanding. So we need media and information literacy at all forms, at formal and informal educational settings. And for instance, Participant Media is a company that produces, you know, Hollywood films and TV, etc. They also have very involved in media education. So it just has strengthened the idea that our work should be understood as a media and information literacy work. And in terms of policy, then we should actually remind our governments the need to include media and information literacy as part of the educational system. So just that comment, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm a teacher in Lebanon, so I'm a history teacher. But what I'm trying to do with my center, my university, we have a research center in my university. We're trying to go to all the schools in Lebanon and trying to, not to educate all the children, we can't do it, but we're trying to explain to the young people how they need to use Facebook, how they need to use Twitter, so that they aren't go to all the groups, you know, we have the problems right now with the Salafist groups in Lebanon. So we're trying to do these things because the government isn't doing it. So they are not taking the web like a priority in Lebanon, so we're trying to do it. So I need to try this year and next year. Maybe I will write an article on it, and I'm gonna see the result. If there is something positive in the teaching, like teaching the web. It's an
I guess just about when you have lack of access to internet on phones and want to have more dialogue, like in the case of Somalia. I mean, there are some platforms out there. Frontline SMS, which was discussed a little bit earlier in some of the earlier presentations, is a good one. It does require internet, but things like WhatsApp and Viber now, I mean, it's amazing to see how much of conversation has moved onto those platforms for group conversations and user groups around all kinds of things in ways that I certainly would not have predicted a couple of years ago, although it does require internet connectivity. And on the successful national platforms that would use technology to feed into a process, I honestly can't think of any great models. I do know Sri Lanka, there was a model that Sanjana was involved in a bit, and which maybe would be worthwhile having a separate conversation about. But it's hard to get it right. And one thing I do notice is that, like many things, there's a minority of people who are usually highly motivated, and then there's a majority who maybe have opinions, but they're not necessarily motivated to act. And I think this is one of the big questions, is always figuring out how do you get the opinions, incorporate the opinions of the people who are not hyper motivated to act. I mean, like when they do polls, like in the US, to ask around how you're going to vote for elections, the first thing they ask you is, did you vote in the last election? And then they ask, are you registered to vote? And then they ask, do you know where your polling station is? And if you answer no to any of those, they discount your voice because they think, statistically speaking, is proven you will not vote. And so I think actually one of the things that's interesting in terms of getting inclusive voices is figuring out how to get the people who maybe are not motivated to act, but do have opinions and wanting to get their voice involved in some kind of national dialogue.
We have 5 minutes. I said that I can't talk about the Sri Lankan example because I'm chairing this. I'm not a panelist. So it's not my place or role to talk about it. But if anybody does want to find out more, please come to me after the session. We have one more question. We have 5 minutes, about 5 minutes more.
Sure, thanks very much. Quick question is, can we talk a bit about the economic angle around this? Because we're talking about dialogue and communication quite a bit in technology, but where's the economic angle? And that's going straight into the power dynamics that technology, through potentially economic empowerment at the grassroots level, could affect the dynamics talking about in terms of peace building. Thank you.
I mean, I guess just on the economic side, I mean, the fact is technology typically costs money. I mean, nothing's for free. And, you know, whenever I go to fairs that talk about great new technology tools, as someone who, you know, often am writing proposals and doing budgets and things like that, the first question is, how much does it cost? What's the opportunity cost? How long does it train someone on how to get someone trained sufficiently on how to use it? You know, and then even if it's something as simple as setting up a Facebook page, where often civil activists will set up a Facebook page, who's going to provide content to it? Do they have someone on staff? And so I think there's actually a pretty big economic cost to a lot of things which technically don't cost any money. But you know, in terms of running projects, often there is quite a bit of cost associated with it. I think I'm probably not completely answering your question, but I often think about overall in the use of technology and the fact that there is this cost, does that then impact who's using it and who tends to be engaged in it? And I think the answer is yes, it does, quite a bit. And it's one of the perennial challenges that I think all of us who are trying to do this work face is, again, how to make that not so much of a barrier.
It's not an answer to your question, but for example, in Sri Lanka, forgive me for saying this, it's also the perception of cost. So when you ask a person, we're doing a more in-depth survey on this, but apocryphally and anecdotally, I can tell you that if you ask a person in Sri Lanka whether they use the internet, most in rural areas will say, no, we don't use the internet because it's too expensive. If you literally ask that same person, are you on Facebook, they will say, yes, we are on Facebook. So Facebook is the internet, and their perception of using Facebook as a utilitarian tool to keep in touch or for whatever other purpose is fundamentally, notionally, perceptionally, ideationally different to the use of the internet. They will spend more on getting data to use Facebook, but they will not even contemplate getting a data plan to surf the web or to go to Google or to access Gmail. There's something very, very interesting happening. I've been told through qualitative research it's the same thing that's happening in Burma as well, along with the introduction of mobile telephony to the country literally a couple of months ago. So The other is the gendered side to it. Women in Sri Lanka tend to not have access to recharge prepaid services as much as their male figures in a family or a community. That has an implication in terms of inclusion as well. So it's a vital question, but it depends on context.
Yeah, just the example of participatory budgeting too that some of you may know about that's in Brazil, or I understand in DRC. They did a survey in terms of how they've achieved to get like 300% increase in participation in the meetings to get the public engaged in participatory budgeting. But when surveyed, over 60% said the reason why they showed up for those meetings was because they received the text. Only under 5% said it was because of either newspaper, television, or radio. So, and the irony there is that SMS is a much, much cheaper option than all the other media the government was using to try to get better turnout at these meetings.
So thank you very much. I hope the panel explored some of the ways in which the power dynamics do influence the introduction of tech. And I think the idea was that the conversation does continue, and that the problematization of the technology's ability to kind of disrupt the tapestries of violence that we deal with is something that the panelists kindled, and the discussions hopefully will continue virtually, if not physically. Thanks very much for participating.